Welcome, everyone. Today we're doing our monthly iMapInvasives webinar for August, and it's about that time of year where people are uh, getting back to school. So our topic this year, or this month, is iMapInvasives in higher education. And uh, we wanted to put together this webinar because we've had many really rewarding and valuable partnerships with academics and college students and professors throughout the years. So we wanted to just highlight some of these partnerships and all the potential there is with iMapInvasives as an educational tool, especially in colleges and universities. And so I'm going to give a brief 2-slide intro, and then we're going to get into our presentations from guest speakers. So today with us, we have Rebecca Hargrave and Jessica Sarauer from SUNY Morrisville. We have Chris Bedurick from SUNY Cortland, and we have Sydney Van Winkle, who now works for the Finger Lakes Prism, which is part of the Finger Lakes Institute at Hobart William and Smith College. But she'll be talking about her experience as a student at RIT, working on an IMAP related project. And so feel free to enter any questions you have into the chat, any questions or comments, and we'll go through them as we go. And at the end, we'll also have time if people want to unmute themselves and um, uh, ask questions that way. We can do that too. And also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. And so with that, I'll get started. So some of you might be new to IMAP, so just a brief overview. It's a centralized invasive species database to support PRISMs, which are the partnerships for regional invasive species management, which New York is divided into, state agencies and other partners working on invasive species issues. But it's really, its main function is the database, but it's also a lot more than that. It's a mapping tool, and it has all of these tools for data summaries and reports. So it's used for mapping species distributions and reporting invasive species. It can also generate summary reports. You can sign up for early detection alerts for species and areas you're interested in. IMAP data can be used in GIS platforms using our web map services. And you can also track treatment and assess results over time. And I'll mention that in New York, IMAP is administered by the New York Natural Heritage Program, where I work, and you can learn more about our organization at mynhp.org. And iMapInvasives is used by several states and provinces in North America, but we are with the New York program. And so as I was saying before, we've had a bunch of really positive partnerships with professors and students and academia in general, often falling into one of these three general categories. So education, on the ground field work, and then showcasing your work, oftentimes with GIS or web mapping. And I won't I think I'll hold off on going into detail about any of those right now because we'll get some really good pictures of what this looks like um, from some of our guest speakers. But really briefly, some examples would be students getting the experience of uh, educating others and training others on how to identify species and how to use iMapInvasives. That's a really useful skill for students to learn. Um, a lot of universities do projects where they'll have certain classes go out and map invasive species and then look at the data afterwards in iMapInvasives. And students with interest in GIS can then use that data and display that data in story maps and dashboards to get more web mapping experience as well. And so for the main part of the webinar today, we'll hear some examples of this sort of work. So we'll start with Rebecca Hargrave and Jessica Sarauer from SUNY Morrisville.
Let's see ourselves. Hello, we're starting our video. Sorry. My name is Rebecca Hargrave. I'm here at Jessica Sarr, and we're going to go over a few of the projects that we do here at SUNY Morrisville. Next. So we've been using iMapInvasives at Morrisville for about 10 years. And when we decided to start incorporating it into our courses, or incorporating invasive species into our courses in a formal way, we decided that iMapInvasives would be a great way to introduce students to citizen science, as Mitch mentioned on one of the earlier slides, and invasive species. And so we've used this as an assignment in multiple courses, as an official assignment, and then we also encourage our students to make casual observations when they're out and about. And we also trained all the faculty in our department with the hopes that they would use it in a lot of different classes, and then also when they are out, they would make observations. And so that has happened as well. Next slide. And so this is some of the observations that our students have made over the years. And so you can see campus in the middle, and there's a significant number of observations in the areas and properties near campus, which we frequent, but we still have lots of opportunities. Next. One of the first places that some of our students encounter iMapInvasives is in our first year student seminar course that they take the very first semester that they come in. And we looked at it as an opportunity to introduce them to a really important topic in natural resources management. And so we train all of our students that are in our environmental sciences department. It's a few different majors. And not only does it introduce them to invasive species and get them thinking about it and making observations, but it also, as like a side note, gets them into using their phone as a data recorder. And so connects them with the technology that they'll be using as professionals, even if it is just their phone and not a professional device of some sort. And I think it's eye-opening for the students that they can do more on their phone than just for fun or look things up. Next.
All right, and I'm Jessica Sarr, as Rebecca said, and I teach our invasive species management class, which is focusing on basically invasive species, but not just plants and insects. We also have fish, wildlife. We cover a variety of topics, and we use IMAP for a number of different things in this course. On the photos there, you can see some students actually mapping some areas that they've been treating in garlic mustard with their phones again. We do a few different projects, but before we can get into the projects, we have to train them. So that in the first couple weeks of class, we focus on training. We do the pre-training work. We set up our accounts together as a group, make sure they're all in. We get them in our Morrisville program. We have our own page on IMAP that we use, so we can track them that way. We get their phones set up. We make them pick if they want, Latin names or common names. Somebody always wants to use Latin, but it doesn't ever always work out. They can't really see what they're identifying. We do the online training provided by the National Heritage Program that came out a couple of years ago once COVID hit. It's been really helpful, especially if a kid can't come to lab that day for some reason, instead of bringing somebody in. And then by the end of the class, we're out there taking our fake observations, looking at detected and not detected, thinking about points, lines, and polygons. We talk about taking good photos. That's really important for IMAP. We try to emphasize that you need to be able to see what you're looking at so you can get a confirmed identification. So just some examples here on our slide as well. We have some hemlock woolly adelgid that we found at Clark Reservation in Syracuse, and then some EAB exit holes. So focusing on taking those good photos. And then we also talk about search time and what that means, how many hours based on the group size. Next slide. I wanted to highlight just 3 projects we work on. There are a ton, right? It's invasive species management class. But one of the first things we do, so we have the training, now we go out to the field and we track emerald ash borer. You can see it's still early in the semester, a lot of snow on the ground. We've been going to this Nichols Pond County Park near campus for 10 years, probably 8-10 years. I took over the class 4 years ago from Rebecca, and the first year we went out there, didn't see anything. It was great. We warned them, like, don't put in an observation if you didn't see anything, because we don't want to alert anybody. And that's the photo there on the left. You can see Chris and Jerry looking at a really nice looking ash tree. 1 year later, Tommy's there on the right, and you can see things have changed. The blonding on the wood there. If I would have zoomed out of the photo, you could see just a bunch of woodpecker damage on the that has fallen from the tree on the snow around. So we've been able to use iMap to track it over time. So we didn't have detections, and now that we do in this area. And it's also hit our campus too, so it's moving. Next slide. Another big project we work on is hemlock woolly adelgid scouting. Once again, beginning of the semester. When there's snow on the ground up here, we have to do things with trees a lot. We go out as a group. We assign a crew leader, and they're in charge of the GPS to make sure we're tracking the area we're actually using. We use a couple different methods. We flip over the branches and look for HWA, but we also use our slingshot Velcroed racquetball method. You can see Jake up here is shooting a racquetball into the canopy. The hope is that somebody is on the other side of the tree ready to catch that ball. Doesn't always happen. We've lost a lot of them. We do this as a group, come back to the lab afterwards. Our crew leader, who has that GPS, helps us decide the area that we actually went to. We all agree on it. You can see I uploaded it in this case. We didn't take photos in this case this time because we didn't detect anything. But if we would have, we'd have definitely provided photos. Next slide. And one more project we work on is our final exam for our class as we do an aquatic invasive species kayaking trip to Leland Pond, which is near campus. And before we can go out there, though, we had to plan our trip. And what we do is we spend some time using iMap to see what's been there in the past, what's already been identified. And then some of these observations are from previous years, but also from other people in the community that have found different invasive species here, fish, zebra mussels, aquatic vegetation. So we plan in advance to know what we're looking for, do some ID. Then for the final exam, we head out there and we kayak around and we upload things that we saw if they're willing to take their phones out while they're in their kayaks. Always, some kids don't want to do that if they don't put them in a special case. But just three big projects we use iMap for, but really in our class, it's a daily thing. One other thing we do, I forgot to mention, was they're required to submit so many observations each semester. So we train them, and then I give them like 4 weeks. You need to upload 10 different observations. And I want them to be invasive species, not Norway spruce or something like that. I want them to be true invasive species. And then later in the semester, like after spring break, new things are emerging. They go around the state, maybe they go home to Buffalo. Then we have another set that's due. So they get a whole range of different species. Next.
So a different class that we use this in is a class that teaches forest protection, and we have a couple monitoring projects that we do as well. So there's a picture here of Spongy egg mass, and so students go out and we use the DEC protocol for determining outbreak levels in different stands. So the students go from plot to plot within the stand, looking and counting egg masses, and then they take observations along the way. We don't mark. At one point in time we would have been marking every single tree, and now with the modified, it's been a few years since it's been modified like this, where you can indicate the number of affected host trees. And so we don't have a point for every single tree, but we can then go back in and look and see how things have changed from one year to the next. This past year, so this was we do this in like April. So in 2021, the stand that we survey had a significant number of spongy mouth egg masses, both new and previous. And then this last year when we were in that stand was found very few. And so it's a great tool. All of these opportunities to do monitoring over time in the same stand, and then be able to go back and look at the data and say, this is what we had last year and this is what we're seeing this year, really helps students understand the importance of continual monitoring. We often have this conversation about, well, this one's already been marked. Well, have we marked this tree? It's still here, so it's still important potentially to come back and re-identify that that's still a particular problem. I put a little note on the slide. We also do some beach bark disease monitoring, and that so there's lots of other things that we'd love to be able to include in the iMap invasive database, and beach bark disease isn't in there, so that's just like my suggestion. And Mitch and I had an email conversation about this earlier. Next slide.
We also have a variety of other projects we've used iMap for. One example shown here, we've 3 years ago, I think, we found some pale swallowwort on some of our campus properties. B&R, or Barrett and Rosecran, in the upper left-hand corner, and then our electrical light stream area. Students were out there actually for a different class, their capstone GIS class, and they found pale swallowwort, and they identified it for us. So we've taken to mapping it and treating it. We are digging it up, of course. We had an intern one summer who worked on this project, but another of our colleagues here takes the freshman intro to forestry class out, and they've monitored some of this for us as well to see how our patches are doing before they explode. We're trying to keep them under check. Next slide.
And then we have another stand that's close to campus that we are in a lot. And this is a really interesting stand because of its proximity to the village of Morrisville, and we have a campus arboretum. And so we find lots of fascinating volunteers, plant volunteers that have shown up in the stand. And so I use this forest for a couple projects. One of them is we intentionally go out and we search intentionally for non-native trees that have established in the stand. We have a few different species. One of the ones that is most problematic is we have an understory and some canopy trees of Norway maple, and the students have gone out and marked all or most of them, and they've been doing some cutting treatments to see how they respond to different height cuttings, and we'll see how that goes. Trying to minimize the seed source that those trees put out and hopefully eliminate them from the stand at some point. But one of the other trees that we've uncovered through this monitoring project is an amber cork tree or corkwood, and it's the only one that we know of in kind of the upstate area. And this tree's been it grew for a few years, and then we found it, and then someone felled a Norway spruce on it, and we thought it was dead, and we thought that was great. But since it's marked, we know where it is. We can go back, and sure enough, it sprouted basically from root fragments. And so having the data, the points, knowing that these things were there, and I can go back and oh, it's still here. Check up on these things and kind of discover new things even in our own backyards. And it's great to be able to take the students and show them these things and say, this is why we're worried. Look where this showed up. We never would have expected this here. So it's been a really great hands-on practical tool that connects them directly with science and practitioners. Can you next slide? And so I'll mention, so Jessica said that, the students go out and collect a lot of points. And one of the things that we have to do is to make sure that we spend time to confirm all the points that they work. And so you can see all the little pink ones. So these are additional points that we have to go in and dedicate some time to, but it just shows, just a reminder, like all the opportunities that we have to connect students to these different little projects, big projects within class or in the summertime. So we try to get our students out there hands-on in the woods with data collectors, and this is a great way to do it. Thanks.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. A lot of great projects and a lot of great stories there. We do probably have time if anyone has any questions for Jessica and Rebecca. We could cover one or two. So I'll wait a second for the chat box, but thank you so much, Jessica and Rebecca, for sharing that and for all the work that you do with IMAP.
Welcome. Sure.
Let me pull up the chat.
Oh.
Okay, I'm not seeing anything yet, but feel free to enter anything and we'll have time at the end. Okay. So then I'll move on to our next section. So next we'll hear from Chris with SUNY Cortland, talking about GIS and web mapping experience for students. So take it away, Chris.
Right. Thanks, Mitch. That was an awesome presentation. Lots of great possible synergies in the different areas that we work in. So looking forward to following up on this conversation after the webinar. So I'm talking about citizen science and web GIS applications. And similar to what we were just talking about a few minutes ago, the idea here is really to expose students to the concept of citizen science and how GIS technology can enable citizen scientists more broadly. So not just the academic community, but also enabling people that are in the community that might want to be participants, but don't have the technical skill necessarily. So I'm working with a couple students that have since graduated, Shelby Soul and Connor Brierton, and I'll talk a little bit about their work as we go. So Mitch, we can go to the next. Yeah, so this first part, this is about a project that I worked on at the Finger Lakes National Forest. This is sort of near Seneca Lake in central New York. And in terms of leveraging higher education, the way that Mitch has sort of phrased this, I think about this as iMapInvasives is a means of enabling collaborations between multiple organizations. So this particular project that I worked on was a collaboration with the Finger Lakes Prism before when Hillary Mosher was working there, and she had a student, Brittany Logley, who also worked there, and we exchanged data sets about invasive plants that they had collected in the field at this location. And then I had a graduate student who was an undergraduate at Cortland, biology student, who graduated and then went to get a master's degree at Binghamton in geography or GIS. And she had a sort of an interesting internship funding experience that Binghamton was sort of promoting. And she worked with me on another data collection effort, a little bit different than what Brittany had done at the Finger Lakes National Forest. And then I had also been in contact with folks from the National Forest Service to look at the broader array of data that they had been working with. So in short, what we had done is we tried to coalesce all this data into one unified database with 3 different data sources. And once we had done that, the idea here that my student Shelby had worked on was to take this data that we have been working with and try to put it into a dashboard type interface to make it easier for people to make sense of the data. So for example, if people are not GIS people and you wanted to have a little bit more actionable method of looking at your data, this is really what these dashboards are intended for. And so a good example of this is that if you wanted to build a dashboard, let's say folks out there that are interested in that, you could download data from iMapInvasives and then upload it back into ArcGIS Online dashboard creation tool to sort of like show the data in a different way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about leveraging IMapInvasives as an information resource, and then doing different things with it with these other tools that we work with. So the context of this particular class here is really geared towards WebGIS development. So the name of the course is WebGIS, and we use the case example of IMapInvasives to show how you can build an effective citizen science WebGIS application. And then we look under the hood a little bit about how it works. And so it takes a little bit more of a technical turn, but in this case, Shelby was to take this work and kind of like build upon it to show a demonstration site that might be a good example for others that might want to use this. So you can see in this graph here, there's multiple maps that I've created over time, but then in this graph, that data had to be pulled out and then put into a graph using Excel, right? So that came out of a CSV file, and it orders the invasive occurrences, right? So these are the presence data, and then this is the extent of the data visualization that you would do with a static data analysis, right? So to improve upon that, you could put this ideally into an interactive dashboard that would make it a little bit easier to visualize all this content. So I think we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so this shows the dashboard that was created, and in this case, the real hallmark of effective dashboards is the integration between different ways of looking at the data. So this is sort of like a data visualization tool. So you can have the map embedded in here. And in fact, you could bring in the iMapInvasives layer directly right into this if you wanted to. But if you wanted to parse it, in this case, this is delimited to the sort of like punctuated boundaries of the Finger Lakes National Forest. If you wanted to just delimit it to just that area, we have that set up. And then we can visualize the content of the data with these automated tools for graphing and for different bells and whistles that you can put on this that sort of like increase visual interest, right? So you can see the 794 number on there. I mean, that's just a number, but there's different visualization methods you can take with this data to kind of like enliven it and guide people to what it is that you want to see. So in this case, she also created exemplar photos of the species that we're working with. Obviously, the top one in this study was multiflora rose. We also have buckthorn, honeysuckle, and I had also so a question that I often have from students is that once we work with this and we talk about data collection, the inevitable question that comes up is, okay, well, what do people do with this data afterwards? And of course, there's always actions that can be taken with invasives. So I happened to go to an event to pull garlic mustard at the Finger Lakes National Forest in an event hosted by the Finger Lakes Prism and also the Cornell invasives group as well. So that's also a potential opportunity. That included students from Cornell that participated in that, and that's another thing that people might be interested in. Okay, I think we'll go to the next slide. Okay, so the benefit of the dashboard approach, you may say, well, why do you want to take this data and then parse it up and redo it in a different way? Well, in this case, you can really target collaborative relationships, right? So in this case, if we're talking about focusing on this particular piece of property or this Finger Lakes National Forest, for example, if you just wanted to focus on that with your other partners, you can really target the conversation and have greater control over updates that might occur about interventions that you may take over time. So in this case, this is another approach of visualizing the data. This is a heat map, right? So you can take the occurrences of various species, either in total or by individual species, and show them with this sort of like a density surface type approach, the heat map. And the nice thing about that is that the WebGIS tools enable this cartographic design to be done with just a few clicks, right? So you don't have to be a desktop GIS person to make more interesting and fancy cartographic products, right? So that's one of the potential benefits of that. The other thing with the dashboard, maybe it's obvious to everyone, is that it's often used as a baseline measure. So if you're taking measurements over long periods of time or you're trying different interventions, it's a good way of sharing changes over time, right? And looking at interventions. And you would think that would draw interest from citizen scientists in the sense of like their work is having an impact on invasive plants in various areas. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, so this part 2 here is work that I've done with another student, Connor Brierton, who is now also a graduate student at Binghamton in geography GIS. And we had a great relationship with Mitch. He hosted Connor as an intern and spent a lot of time working with him. So many thanks to Mitch for doing that. Also, hats off to Meg Wilkinson, who also sort of kicked that off into motion with her good ideas about doing this. So the idea here was that we were talking with Mitch about some of the underreported species and underreported areas of New York State that could actually do, benefit from additional data collection. And Cortland County doesn't have a large amount of data points in iMapInvasives. So we were thinking, what are some of the high priority species, and how can we leverage our my relationship with the university to sort of like build that up, right? So I'm a geography professor, and as you can tell, I teach GIS courses. In this particular case, I was teaching a GPS technology class, which iMapInvasives is also great for, because we talk a lot about geolocation and different methods of identifying species in different locations, right? So it's another example of field data collection technologies, right? So in this case, we were talking about mobile devices. Mobile devices are perfect for this. And you can really do a comparison between, if you're so interested, in accuracy of mobile devices versus GPS. And in my anecdotal evidence that I would share with folks here, that, I found it to be not a great difference in terms of relative accuracy between GPS measurements and using a mobile data collection. So, for what that's worth. So in this case, we were talking about particular species. We talked about, in this case, we're looking at porcelain berry. And what we had done here is that we used ArcGIS Online and a great resource called the New York Protected Areas Database. And we wanted to create a story map, which is another method of creating WebGIS applications. It's relatively straightforward to use. There's some sort of like canned ways of designing interfaces, and you can bring in the IMAP web mapping service directly into this ArcGIS Online interface. So I think we'll go to the next slide. This will be a little bit harder to see. I got small pictures here. So what we're trying to do here was increase the number of or to enable citizen scientists to make additional data collection on hemlock, woolly adelgid, porcelain berry, as I had mentioned, and oriental bittersweet. And we had created 3 different panels in the story map, right? So it's meant to be an information resource for potential citizen scientists or other collaborators that we might want to work with. And each of the panels has additional information about each of those species in particular. So hopefully you can see in this picture here, on the left panel, you can cycle through information about, let's say, porcelain berry, and it has helpful information in there about distinguishing porcelain berry from wild grapes, right? So it's meant to help people and also to show the relationship of where that data might be. So each of the panels is divided into each of those species, and it's meant to be a guide to enable more accurate data collection efforts. So the other thing that I had done with Connor and the GPS class was Connor and I hosted a training to become part of the Certified Trainers Network in the class using the students. And there was 16 students in the class, and one of the benefits for Connor, who was undergraduate at the time, is that he became a certified part of the Certified Training Network for iMapInvasives, which in New York, which I think is a great outcome. And in addition, all the other students in the class are like informed about this, and we use the data directly, right? So once we did the training, which is great. So in addition, as part of the class, we went to iMapInvasives, downloaded some of the data, and then made maps out of it with GIS. So I don't know if you can see that, sort of like on the bottom of the screen here of the slide. There's actually occurrences of garlic mustard that have been taken by the biology department at Cortland in the past, and we downloaded that data and then kind of looked at it and did a sort of a mini analysis of like a what if scenario of what we would do about these locations of garlic mustard. And the other thing I wanted to share about this real quick is that this is during the pandemic, and this really enlivened student participation in this class. So I think I'll leave it at that. I see Mitch made a point that is a story map live in public. I think it is, and I think I can dig up the link and share it with folks. So I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was great. One thing I wanted to call back on one of the points you said. So just looking at this map that the story map that Connor worked on. So I'll use the top one as the example. On the left-hand side, there's the information on the species. And then on the right-hand side, there's a map, and it's pulling in live data from IMAP with the web map services. So instead of having to like download and re-upload data, it's just live. So if someone actually found porcelainberry in Portland, it would just, and they reported it to IMAP, it would pop up on this map without having to make an update. And Chris also mentioned the underreported angle. And so it might be too small on this screen right now, but if we get a link that people can look at later, you can kind of see that we picked species where there's reports around Cortland, but not much in Cortland, if any. So for example, you can see porcelainberry, there's some records in Ithaca and central New York, but not in Cortland. And then HWA is pretty common in a lot of the surrounding regions, but it's not really reported in Cortland, and so on. And so, Chris, if you find a link, would it be okay if I included that in a follow-up email or something for people?
Oh yeah, definitely. It'd be a lot easier to interact with and kind of like peering at these tiny little pictures. Definitely. So yeah, happy to do that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Chris. And if people have more questions, feel free to enter them in. But for now, I'll switch over to our last guest presenter, Sydney, with the Finger Lakes Prism. And maybe to give a little more context to where Sydney's coming from. So for the past couple of years, I've been working with her as in her role with the Finger Lakes Prism. But before that, she was a student at RIT, part of a capstone project with Dr. Christy Tyler. So a student working with IMAP and Finger Lakes Prism. And one of the projects that came out of that group was actually the online training modules that either Jessica or Rebecca mentioned. I think that might have been the year after Sydney, when Sydney was actually a mentor, like a past student who was mentoring the current group. So it's been really great to work with Sydney in these evolving roles, and so I'm happy to hear about her experience.
Thanks, Mitch. That was a really great introduction. You saved me some of the summary I was going to go over. So I'm just going to start by talking a little bit about the background of this capstone course. Prior to my involvement in it, they had been working with iMapInvasives for several years. So from 2014 to 2018, the capstone course worked with iMapInvasives to create invasive species maps and to build different website features. So an example of some of that work is on this slide here. In 2017 to 2018, the capstone group actually identified a gap by surveying a local lake association. And they kind of started to realize that the public knew about invasive species, knew the harm that they were maybe doing in the environment, but they weren't reporting them. They weren't reporting them in iMapInvasives, and they also just weren't reporting them to organizations. So in 2018 to 2019, the year that I was involved the most in this capstone project, RIT decided to add another partner. So that was the year that Finger Lakes Prism became involved. And the project kind of shifted focus a little bit to begin to investigate ways to successfully engage communities in invasive species programs, specifically for reporting. So we ended up analyzing a lot of different kinds of data. We had qualitative data and quantitative data, and I'll talk just a little bit more about that next. So next slide, Mitch. So just a little more information for the 2018-2019 year. Our main goal was to improve knowledge, detection, and reporting of a few high priority invasive species by really starting to understand recruitment, retention, and engagement of volunteers who are participating in these reporting efforts. So we did this kind of in a number of ways. We analyzed historic IMAP user data. And then we also surveyed and interviewed participants from 2 different programs to start to look at volunteer characteristics in these programs, how people rated different program trainings, if and how the type of training they received influenced their future reporting for invasive species, and if there were trends in aquatic or terrestrial species being reported in iMapInvasives. Next slide. So the 2 programs that I keep talking about are 2 different programs. One was with iMapInvasives and one was Finger Lakes Prism. And we kind of use these 2 programs as individual case studies to understand these 2 different groups that we were looking at. So within iMapInvasives, we use the Certified Trainers Network. So this network is a group of people that use the train the trainer approach to increase iMapInvasives training capacity across New York State. And they provide public trainings on how to use IMAP, basically. Just generally, this group of people were a little bit younger age ranged, and they were more tech savvy. Compared to our Finger Lakes Prism program, which was the Macrophyte Survey Program, which is specific to the Finger Lakes region. And members in this program collect data during the summer months on aquatic invasive species, and they report findings directly to the Finger Lakes Prism staff, and this data does ultimately end up in iMapInvasives. Generally, this group at the time was an older age range of people, and they weren't as tech savvy as the folks that were in the Certified Trainers Network. Next slide. So just going to give a really brief overview of a few major outputs and a few findings. There's a lot to this data set. I'll talk a little bit more on this, but the project has continued for many years, so there's even more now. But in 2018 and 2019, when the project began, we were kind of laying the ground for future work to happen. So the capstone course at RIT is usually like a 5-year project, and each year they just make progression based off of previous year's findings. So for the 2018 and 2019 group, we drafted an engagement plan for community science programs. So you're seeing a snapshot of that plan on the right side of the screen, the really colorful document there. We also conducted several iMapInvasives trainings for students at RIT, for different Lake Association members, and then for the Macrophyte Survey Program volunteers, and we all became certified master trainers. We started a Macrophyte Survey Program story map, which was displaying IMAP data, filtered IMAP data. And you can see that story map at the bottom of the screen. That story map is still being worked on today. And then we also started a scientific paper with some of our findings about community science. So just a few findings. There are many more than this. I'm happy to talk to anyone after the webinar if you're interested. So we looked at motivators for reporting in IMAP specifically, and the 2 main ones that we got back were combating invasive species And people also said they wanted to serve their communities. The folks that were in the Macrophyte survey program at the time cited combating invasive species as the main reason that they were in the program and reporting. And then we did also collect a few recommendations for these programs for the future. And some of those that came back were people wanted to know how their reporting of invasives was making a difference in management. And then people also said that they wanted more training on species identification and not just training on how to report or use different apps to report a finding of an invasive. Next slide. So, as I've mentioned a few times, this collaboration has just continued. I still work closely with the RIT Senior Capstone Group and iMapInvasives. Like I said, this specific project that started in 2018 with my capstone group has continued on, and I have been a participant in that project for all of that time. So it's really great to see just how the project has changed and how they've kind of gone in different directions with it. The Finger Lakes Prism also collaborates with iMapInvasives on a number of other projects. So we use iMapInvasives obviously as a reporting tool. All of the data that we collect goes into IMAP, but we also use it heavily as an informational tool and kind of a guide for us. When I need to know the layout of the land, I often pull up IMAP first. If I get questions about different invasives on a lake in a certain area, I'm looking at iMapInvasives for that information. And then just another note, RET students in the capstone course become certified trainers every year. They host IMAP trainings and they get to interact with the Finger Lakes Prisms volunteers, which is great. And then I also wanted to just say that RIT also collaborates with IMAP on a number of other projects outside of this capstone course. I know that other courses, our GIS course uses IMAP. And there was a recent graduate thesis that was using Google Street View and IMAP data to develop AI technology to identify different invasive species along roadways. So that's super interesting. And I think it just speaks to how this platform and tool database can be used for so many different ways in higher education. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Sydney. One theme that seemed to come up across multiple presentations, and it just started in my mind, so I might not word it the best, but so IMAP is used by so many different groups and for different purposes. It really allows for like collaborative data sharing and data collection. And it can be really about a valuable experience for students to kind of join in on that and join this network of professionals and academics across the state working on these invasive species issues. Yeah, so it provides a lot of opportunities for students to understand projects going on around the state and also in some cases network with professionals in the field. So a huge thank you to all three of our presenters. I'll just do a really quick wrap up and then we can see if there are any questions for any of, oh, and I said all three of our presenters because I'm looking at 3 names, but there are 4. Thank you to all 4. So I just wanted to bring up this slide as a wrap up. So there's kind of these 3 main categories where iMapInvasives integrates with higher education. And people on the call, you might be interested in all 3, you might be interested in 2, just 1. One thing to know is that it's really flexible. So if you are just interested in the idea of students going out and collecting data and then looking at the data, and that's as much as you can fit into your curriculum, that's great. We're happy to work with that. If you're interested in a different piece, that's cool too. And as you can see, as from some of our examples, some of them used multiple of these topics and some of them focused on one. And we have a web page, which is starting to compile all this information, nymfinvasives.org/educators. You can also get there just by clicking, there's a button that says educators at the top of our homepage. And remember that it's nymfinvasives.org. And you can also email us, and we're happy to talk about how to get started on any of this sort of stuff. And so that's where I'll end it for now. And I'm going to open up the chat box to see if there are any things we should discuss.
Mitch, while you're doing that, can I address Chris's question that he posted? This is Rebecca.
Yes. Yep.
So Chris put in the chat question about cell phones and service and issues. And while we typically don't have, well, there are definitely places where we go that there is not cell service. And Meg mentioned that if you get it all set up ahead of time, it works well. The one thing that we do run into is that if there isn't service, the map doesn't necessarily show you where you are. And so I just tell them that they have to trust that it's working. Most smartphones these days have a separate GPS unit that does not rely on cellular service. And so that operates independently. That may not be the case with every student's phone. We have some iPad or some tablets that have a separate GPS in them. They don't even have a cellular connection, but so we will loan out the tablets to the students that don't have if they don't have an appropriate phone for the data collection. But that's really the only difficulty that we've run into, is that the students are expecting the map to change, and if there's not cell service, it doesn't. And it usually works out fine. Usually.
Awesome. Thank you. There is another question. I'll read it, and any of our presenters who want to chime in. So it's for those of you including use of the iMap mobile app to collect data with your students, have you encountered issues with regard to equity of access for participation? Anything to keep in mind with device/data plans, students who don't drive/have a car, etc. Rebecca covered some of that maybe, but not all of those things. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll just add a little bit more. So we do have those tablets that we loan out, and they're not fancy tablets. They're just Samsung. They were like $90 or something like that. And we use them for other data collection too. And so that has certainly helped. And whether it's they don't have one or they break it the day that they need it. And so there's also that. For our assignments, we don't require them to drive anywhere. They can walk plenty of close places to get to invasive species on campus. And for our field labs and things like that, we generally transport them. And so for students that don't have access to transportation for our projects, it's usually not a problem. But that is definitely something to consider if they're not doing it within the class time, is how are they going to get to those places?
Great, thank you.
Oh, I have a comment on that. So with one of my volunteer programs, kind of touches on this, but not exactly. If my volunteers don't have like a smartphone or some device that they can do in the field for iMap, we'll have them collect like latitude, longitude information. And maybe they can still take a picture, they could use like a camera, and then when they get back to their house, they can still upload that data if they have all the pieces of information using the desktop version of iMap. It's definitely like a workaround solution, but we do have a few people in our volunteer programs who use that instead of doing it out in the field.
Great, thank you. And another question, are IMAP tools set up to be readable by screen readers? I'm actually not sure, and we are discussing this accessibility issue in the next few months, actually. So that is one thing that I can definitely look into, but I don't have an answer for that right now. But very good question. Okay, I'll do one last call for questions. And as I'm waiting for any last minute questions to come in, I'll just say once more, thank you so much to Jessica, Rebecca, Chris, and Sydney, both for the work that you've done and the collaboration with iMap, and also for taking the time out of your day today to come share the great work that you've done. So thank you so much. And I hope you and everyone else here are ready to get back into the school year, and I hope everyone has a great year.